Hey guys, you're listening to the Forestry Project Podcast with me, your host, Jace McCauley. We are the source for how to better manage your land and achieve forest legacy reimagined. So let's get into the show, and I hope y'all enjoy it. And with that, welcome to episode 5 of the Forestry Project Podcast. Episode 5, man, I cannot believe we've gotten to this point. It has been an incredible, almost up to 2 months now since the entire Forestry Project was released. And I did not realize when I was getting into all of this just how much it would impact me and how incredibly grateful I am for being able to do this, having the opportunity to sit down and be on the podcast, make the videos, and get all of the support that I have been shown so far. It is truly humbling, and all I can say is God is great. So with that, guys, in episode 5, I want to discuss effective management and its effects on the ecosystem. So in episode 3 of the podcast, we talked about a little bit of ecology and using ecology as a primer for then understanding how to manage your land more effectively, but also more in line with what the ecosystem historically had out there. And then we talked about in episode 4, getting a management plan and coming up with one big goal that you're going to want for your management. Now, I want to start discussing a little bit of tying those two together, and even really tying in episode 2 where I was talking about the 4 W's, tying all of that in together so that we can start seeing how we manage stuff on the landscape, how it affects the ecosystem already established, and then we can start understanding how our management is best served to that landscape. And what I mean by that a little bit is looking at what we do out on the landscape to then determine how we can be most efficient and effective in our management. Because like we talked about in episode 4 or the management plans, we don't have unlimited time. Typically there is some limiting resource, either it's time, it's cost, it's acreage. There's always something. So being able to understand how your management is affecting the landscape is the only way to really be able to be as efficient as possible with what you're able to do, whether it's how often you're able to get out there, the amount of money you can spend on management, or you don't have the acreage for certain things. And we'll get into that a little bit, showing some examples or discussing some examples from my land and some of the experiences that I have had starting to getting into management on the property and looking at a little bit of restoration projects that we've got going on. First and foremost, though, I did want to mention, and I'm very excited to talk about this, the Forestry Project Podcast is now on YouTube. So you can get on YouTube, go to the Forestry Project's YouTube channel, and you will see episodes 1 through 5 listed up there. We've got a playlist, and that will all be coming out at the same time this podcast airs. And that playlist will have each of the podcasts. So if you're listening to the podcast and instead of listening, you want to see me and all the stuff I'm working with, go ahead and go over to the YouTube channel and watch us from there. I've lined everything up where the times will be the same. So if you want to listen to part of the episodes that you're driving and then you want to go back and watch part of the episode, you can. Just go to whatever time you stopped on the audio podcast or video podcast, and you can pick it up with the same time on the other one, and everything will kind of coincide with each other. So with that, guys, I'm very excited to talk about that. Now let's get into management and its effects on the landscape. So I was reading a paper last week for my forest history class, and it was a lecture from 1903, and the person was talking about how an ecosystem starts on a landscape that is completely virgin. So what I mean by that is if you take, say, like a volcano, for instance, and the volcano erupts, it spews the magma out, that magma hardens. Now you have rock that has never had anything growing on it. And he was discussing the process of small, lichens and moss growing to then start building up your soil. Now, this takes hundreds and thousands of years to fully go from rock to a forest ecosystem. But we can look at places, like Yellowstone, Hawaii, and see that eventually it does grow back to a forested ecosystem. And as I was reading that, it made me start thinking about some of the experiences that I had had in management so far. And I wanted to kind of discuss a few key points that I want you to consider if you've listened to the Ecology podcast and the Management Plan podcast, so that you can start going in, observing how your management is then affecting the landscape, understanding the species that you're trying to manage, so that then you can go in and see what to do, what not to do, what is the most effective and efficient use of your time, resources, whatever that may be. So I wanted to discuss a couple things as far as how in ecology you're going to have the interaction between the living environment, let's say your trees, your understory vegetation, and then your non-living environment, so the climate, sunlight, water, and how both of those kind of interact, but also how we can kind of manage for those a little bit. So if you think about it, sunlight is typically in a forest setting, sunlight is going to kind of be your limiting factor. And, we can get into looking at your pH level, looking at, your nitrogen content. If you were going to go like lime an area, or you were going to apply fertilizer, and we can look at that as a limiting factor, and it most certainly can be. But when you think about it in the most basic primal function, sunlight is really the most limiting factor. And just as a little example of that, so as a forest progresses, let's say you have an old ag field that is growing up, you've quit farming on it or whatnot, you're not going to cut it, so it's going to grow up into a forest. And typically you're going to have, and we'll get into this in a second, but you'll have certain seeds come in that spread by wind. They're easily wind disseminated. They're easily wind disseminated, and once you get those in, they will start growing in the area, and eventually they're going to what we call have canopy closure. So no sunlight is reaching the ground. Now, I want to discuss a little bit of how seeds spread and tolerance of plants. So if you think about sunlight in that instance, some species grow better in, well, they're more tolerant of shade. I hesitate to say they grow better, but they're more tolerant of shade. So take your American beech, for example. it is much more tolerant of growing in the shade, or a dogwood is the same. It's very tolerant of growing in the shade versus a loblolly pine, which we call is one of the pioneer species. So it is one of those. It's got wind disseminated seeds. The seeds spread through the wind, and it will grow up really quickly after a disturbance. Now that disturbance can merely be you cutting the land, and then when you stop that disturbance, so anytime you're cutting the area, you're disturbing it and resetting it, and the grasses are going to continue to grow. Now, if you quit cutting it, then you would start letting the woody vegetation come in, the trees come in, and you would start getting more of those pioneer species that can handle direct sunlight and spread very easily. That's going to be your loblolly pine, your sweet gum. Chinese privet is also a very good one, which Chinese privet's a bit of an anomaly because it grows really well. Sunlight, no sunlight, that that stuff is very hard to get rid of. But we can look at how a species spreads and its tolerance of shade to then start looking into how we can manage for it best. So, an example, a few years ago, I had got a couple plants from the Walker County Forestry Planning Committee's tree sale, and specifically, I remember a persimmon tree that I had, and we didn't really have a good place to plant it yet. So we were going to go in and we were going to put it in a 5 gallon bucket and let it start developing a better root structure. And then when we figured out where we were going to plant it, we would just dig up a big enough area for that 5 gallon bucket and either try to get the dirt out of the bucket or, figure out how to break the bucket apart and replant it into the soil, or replant the persimmon into the soil. And I'd laid it out in the backyard. I'd set it out in the backyard, open sunlight, and it grew good for a little bit. And then it started kind of growing pearly. It started looking fairly sick. The leaves were starting to turn, but we were starting to get into the heat of the summer, and I was getting to experience that the persimmon was kind of going through a drought condition, and it could not handle the direct sunlight at that time. So we took and moved them under the shade of a water oak nearby, and all of a sudden the persimmon just leafed out again and started growing great. Now I look at that and think, well, okay, we can do the same thing on a larger scale if you're looking at planting species or trying to get some species into an area. And I've discussed this in a couple of videos, but if I were to go in on my property and cut all of the loblolly pine off and it be back to bare soil, I'm then going to have to deal with those pioneer species coming back in. And when you open up all that light into the understory, the Chinese privet is going to just expand and multiply like crazy. So, if we understand how to manage for sunlight, we can then start looking at what species need best. So let's say you want to get a longleaf ecosystem in back under a loblolly canopy. And we discussed this a bit in the ecology podcast. But if I cut all the trees down and then went back in and planted longleaf, I'm now going to have to deal with a lot of competition. Whereas I understand that longleaf is a little bit more tolerant of shade when it's growing. So I could go in and plant longleaf in the understory of the loblolly that I have, let it grow for a few years, because how longleaf grows, the first couple of years it's going to stay in the grass stage and really develop a strong root system. And then once it starts bolting, or in the top starts growing, it can then grow really rapidly. But when it starts doing that, it likes to have more direct sunlight. So what I could go in and do is managing for that sunlight. I could plant the longleaf in an area, give it 3 or 4 years to develop that root system as it's still in the grass stage, and then go out, cut some of the overstory trees, and now I'm giving it a head start to kind of outcompete the competition, the Chinese privet that's going to come up. Also, by keeping those trees, I can have, or keeping a few of the overstory pine, I can have needles to keep a decent amount of fuel so that I can burn it every so often. And that would help me a little bit control those invasives as well. So understanding how sunlight can affect your trees and understanding kind of how to manage for that is very beneficial. Now, at the same time, you can also look at sunlight will affect how a species grows. So it will affect how the buds form on the tree. It will affect the limb structure. So if you've ever seen a tree that's just growing out on its own in a field, it's really full, it's not quite as tall, and what it makes up for in height, it has a much wider diameter crown. But it doesn't have to grow as tall because it's not trying to compete with anything else for that sunlight. It can grow out and capture as much sunlight as it could ever need. Now, if you look at, when they plant pine trees, say you're going to have, a 7 foot by 10 foot spacing, that is going to make the pine trees grow taller faster because they're going to be competing with each other for that sunlight. So you're going to get a lot straighter trees, straighter boles, and then you will get a lot less limbs in the lower portion of the tree because once it grows up, all of that out of the sun is going to start getting self-pruned. The tree will cure those limbs and then remove them. So you'll get better quality wood by planting them closer together. Now, of course, there is always a too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So if you planted your trees too close together, they're just going to compete with each other, and eventually they're going to start killing each other off through competition. So if you planted trees, a foot by foot apart, it's not going to be really any more efficient than if you planted them, say, 7 foot by 7 foot apart. Now, that may be a little bit of exaggeration, and that's where having a forester, if you're going to replant, you kind of find that sweet spot of how many trees you're willing to pay for per acre, and then you look at the spacing. But that's just how sunlight can affect the trees that you have growing on your property. Now, if you also think about water, for instance, so water can also be a limiting factor on your landscape. And if you've watched some of our videos, you'll see I'm restoring some oak savanna and some longleaf pine. Those two sites are going to be kind of drier. And then I have the area immediately surrounding the pond. And then I have the ravines, and most of the ravines that we have on the property are going to have some sort of a creek. Now, it may not flow year-round, but it will be wetter down in there. It'll also be cooler. I've noticed that it's kind of funny when I film videos. I typically film early in the morning, and we've had some crazy weather in Alabama here lately, but it's been fairly cool a couple of times that I would be out, and it may be in the mid to upper 30s on the upland sides. And then I would go down in the ravine and it would chill off a little bit more. And in the upland sites, I would not see my breath. But in the lowland sites, in the bottomlands or in the ravines, you could actually see my breath as a, fog, mist. So having those lowland areas, they're going to have different soil moisture and they will have different sunlight. So if you think about, your slope aspect, you can also get into sunlight there. Now, if you have, depending on what hemisphere you're in, so the northern hemisphere that we're in, the sun, if you have the equator going around the earth, the sun is always technically going to be a little bit to our south. Even if you look up in the middle of the day and the sun looks like it's overhead, it's going to be a little bit to the south. So those south-facing slopes are going to get a little bit more sunlight than your north-facing slopes. You can also look at that as your east and your west-facing slopes. So the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. And if you look at your east-facing slopes, the morning sunlight is not going to be as intense as your evening sunlight is. So those north and those east slopes are going to have a little bit less intense sunlight than your south or your west-facing slopes are. Now, with sunlight also comes increased evaporation, so your south and your west-facing slopes will also be slightly drier than your north and your east-facing slopes. And we're just kind of getting back into everything is interconnected. So when you look at the ecology of your site, you're not just looking at what tree species are out there or what your understory is. You're also having to look at, direction, sunlight, water, moisture content, and then we can get into, what is your rainfall. All of this stuff can come in and start impacting how you manage your land. But you can also go in and start impacting how you use that for management. So we were planting pawpaw recently, and pawpaw have deeper roots. They require a lot of moisture content. So when I was planting those, I made sure I planted one right next to the pond. I'm going to see how that does. And then I planted two off down in separate ravines near creeks, and we'll see how those do. Now, with the creeks, they're not full of water all the time, so we'll see how that affects it going into the future. But most of this is an experiment, anyways, so I get to kind of showcase that. Now, another thing I want to kind of talk about is how seeds spread. So we discussed the loblolly pine has wind disseminated seeds. They spread very far because they don't weigh a lot. Now, if you take an oak tree, for instance, an oak is going to have gravity spread seeds. So they're going to fall and they're not going to spread out very far from the tree. Now, you can also get some animal movement in there. Maybe a squirrel will take it and bury it somewhere else, and you can get a little bit of spread that way. But for the most part, most of the acorns are going to fall under the tree. Now, if you think about that from sunlight, again, the species that have gravity disseminated seeds is going to be a little bit more tolerant of shade than trees with wind spread seeds. So if you think about it, an oak tree, an oak seedling, when it grows, is going to be growing under the shade of the oak that's already there. Now, that may not mean that they can grow full with that oak there, but it's really a cool thing to watch about nature, because you can get in and those trees, the overstory tree will eventually die after it reaches maturity, and then the seedlings that have grown up under it from those acorns or, whatever else you want to talk about, that have gravity disseminated seeds, even really longleaf pine kind of fits into this a little bit. But then those seedlings are ready to go. They've got a head start. They've built up that root system to then grow back and take its place. So understanding, how seeds spread is also beneficial for learning how to manage your land, because maybe you want to go in, let's say you're going to do a hardwood forest and you're converting your pines to hardwoods. Maybe you don't want to cut your pines immediately. You want to get some hardwoods growing in the understory, give them a few years to get established, and then remove your overstory, increase your sunlight, and those trees that you planted will have a bit of a head start versus if you cut all the trees down and then went back in and replanted. Now, you will have a few damaged in the harvest, and that's kind of another thing I want to talk about when we're managing land is understanding, like I'm dealing with this with the beaver now. We can't control every part of nature. It's the same with predators when you're talking about wildlife. You will never remove all the predators. You will never remove all of the beavers. And I don't think it's a smart thing to even try to do that. Now, I'm not a wildlife expert. I will say that up front, first and foremost. But take beavers, for instance. Now, I could get rid of the beaver on my property. And then I may not have as much to worry about of, it cut down a tree that I wanted. But that is what happens in nature. And part of my desire as a land manager is I want to manage for nature. I want to help it, but I don't want to manage against what's naturally already kind of happening out there. Now, some instances you may want to. So I like to kind of think about this like a guiding hand of land management or a godlike hand of land management. So if you take your guiding hand of land management, that may be in the oak savanna stand that we have. Maybe I'm just going to implement a prescribed fire in there and then see what it does, see what species grow back, and whatever kind of grows back in is what I have, because I'm relying on the fire to do its job as an agent of disturbance is what we're trying to do in the landscape, and removing the species that aren't adapted for that and the species that are adapted to come back in afterwards to come back in and repopulate that area. Now, if you look at, say, the Pocosin area, now a lot of your wetland trees are going to rely on water spread seeds. So if you think about, like swamps and stuff, take like your overcup oak, a few other species, they spread by the water moving them around. So if I removed all the overstory trees, I could remove all the overstory trees in the Pocosin stand forever, and I'm not going to get the tree species that I want for that area back because they're not going to have any way to spread there. So I have to go in and plant the species that I want. Now, if we think about that from a broader perspective, you can apply that on a very large scale of sometimes if you want something very specific, you have to be very specific in your management. So if you're wanting a loblolly pine plantation and your main goal is income generation and revenue from timber harvest or a non-timber resource, you can justify going in and planting loblolly pine, planting it the exact spacing that you want, and controlling exactly what's out there through herbicide applications or whatnot. Or you can go in and just say, I want this type of an ecosystem. I'm going to start implementing this management practice and be able to start work and get toward that. So, understanding what species you want out there, understanding how they move into an area, how tolerant they are of shade, what water content they're going to need or water moisture they're going to need, will then help you start determining how you can manage best. And I'm not saying having a guiding can of management is better than going out there and planting a plantation. Now, that all kind of goes back into what are your goals as a landowner, and you need to decide what you want most. So if you're set on, I have this amount of land and I want it for income generation, your best opportunity to achieve that is going again and planting a species that will grow quickly. And they have some improved loblolly seedlings that you can use, a few other things, but that's something you want to consider. Whereas if you're going in and restoring the ecosystem, and let's say you're just doing a restoration project, it may be whatever would be there naturally from whatever management activity you're going to do. Let's say that's fire. So if you're going to go in and manage that area just to get it back to a historic landscape, you can start off just going in and burning. You don't have to go in and plant all of these seedlings in and then figure out how to manage for those, or completely cut down your overstory, and then you're left trying to manage a lot of invasives before you can establish the forest type that you want. So understanding how species interact with their environment and how your plan is then going to go in and impact that, and how your management has an impact on your progress, not just in what you do, but the after effects of that can be very beneficial when you're deciding what type of management and how much management that you're going to put out on the property. Now, part of that then goes into do something on your land. And I kind of want to finish with doing something and understanding, how a forest is going to progress and then how you can manage for that. So nowadays, if you do nothing on your forest, you are going to have invasives come in. That's just, nature of the beast nowadays, especially like you've seen on my property. We have a lot of Chinese privet. I didn't go out there and plant Chinese privet, most certainly, but it is such a common species now in the Southeast that you're going to have that. In other areas, it may be Kogan grass, it may be Yopon, whatever the dominant invasive species is for your area, it is going to be there if you do nothing. So going out and doing anything is always going to be beneficial. Now, depending on, what type of forest you want, say you want a climax forest that is going to be your beech, your maple, a few other hardwoods, you don't want to burn. You don't want to introduce any disturbance that's going to set that progression back. But if you're wanting an ecosystem in an earlier successional period, let's take like your longleaf ecosystem. It's kind of a climax forest if you want to consider that the Southeast has historically burned quite often, and that presence of disturbance kind of maintained the ecosystem the way it was. But if you didn't have any prescribed fire in the Southeast, it would eventually go to a true climax forest, I guess you would say, of those disturbance intolerant species. So take, your beech, for instance. They don't do well in a prescribed fire scenario. So you would have beech, you would have maple. Now, you also can use fire, understanding how the regeneration of those seedlings come into play. So take your maples, your dogwoods, for instance. If I burn through an area and I kill a maple or I kill a dogwood, it is going to resprout from that root structure and from that stem. And instead of having one central stem, you may have 5 or 6 growing right around it. So if your whole goal is, leaf cover and you want leaf browse at animal level, it may be that you won't maple or dogwood, whatever species is good for that, and then burn it decently often, say every 3 or 4 years, and kill those on top of ground plants, and then let the roots re-sprout, and you'll get more stems per that root structure. So understanding also, how species react to disturbance can help you start getting into management and understanding how best to manage the property to achieve the goals that you want. And kind of finishing up with that successional piece and getting out on the property is, if you look at what the ecosystem was historically, and then you look at what you want it to be, you can kind of start getting into how often you need to do management. Say you want a later successional habitat, you may not have to burn as often as if you want an early successional habitat. Take, grasses versus trees, for instance. If you want grasses, you have to continuously mow those grasses. You have to continuously introduce disturbance to keep them at that very early successional habitat versus, if you wanted it to grow up into a forest, you have to limit those disturbances to then let it progress through that successional phase into a more closed canopy forested setting. And then if you wanted a late climax forest, take your beeches and your maples, for instance, you would want disturbance even less often versus if you wanted an early climax forest, we'll call it, of a longleaf stand, you want that more often disturbance of fire. And you can even begin to look at that in the understory, even under the take a longleaf pine. If you want it more open pine grassland savanna under it, you're going to want to burn more often than if you're looking for a thicket style habitat. So understanding how a forest progresses through time, understanding how resources can affect that forest moving throughout time, and then how you can, as a manager, impact those resources to benefit what you want done on the property is key. And I hope I am able to demonstrate that and express that through the videos we put out, through the podcasts that we put out, and help you as landowners be able to accomplish that, accomplish your goals, and achieve Forest Legacy reimagined on your land. So with that, that's the podcast episode. Thank you so much for listening. And I encourage you, if you like the content that we're putting out, go follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. On Facebook, just search the Forestry Project. On Instagram, we're the_Forestry Project. We have a YouTube channel, The Forestry Project, and you can also find us on the website at forestryimagined.com. If you enjoy the content, please share it with a friend or a family member that you think will get something out of it. And I encourage you, please go on Apple, Spotify, whatever it may be that you listen to this podcast on, and write us a review. If you really want to support the channel, go on both platforms and write us a review. Those reviews and the analytics that we're getting through watching videos, listening to this podcast, is supporting us more than you would ever know. And that is going to be the true thing to get the Forestry Project from its very humble beginnings to a source that you can go to that is anything land management to help you better manage your property. So with that, guys, I appreciate your support. Thank you for all you've done so far. And I encourage you, just keep it up, and let's see how much of an impact we can get the Forestry Project to have. With that, guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. And until next time, happy management and God bless.